That's right. You will wake up to news that you didn't know the night before.
It's a conversation. It's not just me and Eamon.
We want to get to know you, and we want you to get to know us.
From 6, it's Breakfast with Eamon and Isabel.
Monday to Thursdays on GB News.
Britain's news channel.
Westminster is going around in ever-decreasing circles, followed by the media. Britain is broken. How on earth did we get into this mess? But more importantly, how do we get out of it? Join me at 7 p.m, Mondays to Thursdays on Farage, here on GB News. We will have open, rational debate. We've got to work out how Britain moves forward from this. Join us here on GB News, the People's Channel. Britain is watching.
When the news happens, it happens here.
And really important breaking news.
Breaking news this morning.
On TV, radio and online, the news starts here on Britain's Newsroom.
All the biggest stories and the answers that you need from across the UK and beyond.
Join Britain's Newsroom from 9:30 on GB News.
The People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Join me, Patrick Christie's Monday to Friday, 3 till 6. We tackle the day's news agenda like you've never seen before. It's high tempo, high octane, the most controversial topics and the best guests. You will not be able to take your eyes and ears off it. I'm not afraid to ask the questions that you really want answered. 3 till 6 p.m, Monday to Friday on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
People in Britain, they love free speech, but they also love fair play.
I don't care if I'm speaking somebody from a trade union, from the Labour Party, somebody from the SNP. And I think the viewers like to see that actually we can challenge one another, but in a positive way.
We think we ask the questions that people want to ask, and often we ask the questions that we wanted to ask in Parliament but never got the chance to ask.
So join us every Saturday, 10 a.m. till noon on GB News,
Britain's news channel.
It's all about family, being in people's living rooms, all the interaction and getting to know who our viewers and listeners are.
When I was young, my dad used to say, Nana, stop arguing. I wanted an outlet that would enable me to give my opinion.
People are going through a really hard time right now, and I know that you don't feel like you're being listened to by the establishment. I came to GB News because it's the People's Channel, and I want the audience to have their say on the events of the day.
We're dynamic. We do something different.
Democracy shows that the wisdom of the nation is in its people.
I get to travel to find out what the story is from a personal perspective.
The British people aren't fools. We know when we're not being told the full story.
We've got to work out how Britain moves forward from this.
It's the best country in the world.
The establishment had their chance. Now we're here to represent your views.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
We're proud to be GB News,
the People's Channel,
Britain's news channel.
Hello and welcome. This is the Common Sense Crusade with me, Emma Webb, on TV, online and on your wireless. Tonight we will be discussing the mob violence against Christians in Pakistan and why some people this week have been saying that white people are not representative of Britain. Later in the show, I'll be speaking to Tammy Peterson about her faith journey and the news from Canada that a woman has died after being denied an organ transplant because she wasn't vaccinated. And in The Duel, my panellists will be discussing, is the UK morally obliged to pay slavery reparations? Rafe, what do you think?
No reparations, no apologies. It's time we celebrated Britain and Christianity for upending thousands of years and ending slavery.
Stephen?
If the slave trader was operating last week or the week before, then there'd be a case, and we all know where in the world that is happening. But for something that happened 300 years ago, I'm sorry, give me a break.
But before all of that, it's the news with Tatiana Sanchez.
Emma, thank you very much and good evening. This is the latest from the GB Newsroom. Tory MP Nadine Dorries has resigned her common seat, accusing the Prime Minister Rishi Sunak of demeaning his office by opening the gates to whip up a public frenzy against her. In her resignation letter, Ms Dorries accused Mr Sunak of abandoning the fundamental principles of conservatism, and she said that history will not judge you kindly. Well, she declared in June that she would leave her Mid-Bedfordshire seat with immediate effect, but despite this, she went on to try to find out why she was refused a seat in the House of Lords. It was thought she'd get a peerage in Boris Johnson's resignation honours list. She'd been coming under increased pressure to step down since June. Most of Spain's coaching staff has resigned following the conduct of Luis Rubiales at last weekend's Women's World Cup final. Rubiales is currently suspended by FIFA from all football-related activities as he's accused of grabbing star player Jenny Hermoso's head and kissing her on the lips following Spain's victory at the World Cup. He said it was a spontaneous and consensual little peck and said false feminists were trying to kill him. A statement from the coaches said he offered a story that does not reflect in any way the feelings of Jenny, who stated she felt the victim of aggression. The RMT union says a roadmap to a negotiated settlement could bring an end to the ongoing dispute over pay, jobs and conditions. Today's train strikes continuing for a second year come as many people head off on summer holidays or travel to events such as the Notting Hill Carnival. Assistant General Secretary of the RMT union, Eddie Dempsey, says the government's modernisation plans are not in the interest of passengers.
What we're seeing now is the centrepiece of the government's modernisation plans, which we've been warning about for a long time, is the closure of every ticket office in the country and the de-staffing of the railway, dehumanisation of the railway. And their plans around this are not to improve things for the passengers, are not because we've all suddenly become networked and modern and don't need to interact with other humans. This is purely about ensuring profits for the private companies that have got a stake in our railways now continue to flow. And we think this is just one part of what we regard as the managed decline of Britain.
And the deputy head of the British Museum stepping aside while a police investigation into stolen artefacts is underway. The museum's head, Hartwig Fischer, resigned yesterday and an unnamed member of staff has been sacked. It's understood that the items, which include gold jewellery and semi-precious stones, were taken over a significant period of time. Former Chancellor George Osborne, who's now the museum's chairman, says some of the items have already been recovered. He's promised an independent review to look into how the museum missed warning signs. This is GB News across the UK on TV, in your car, on digital radio and on your smart speaker by simply saying play GB News. Now it's back to Emma.
Now, a nursery school in Hull has withdrawn a children's book called Grandad's Pride because it shows drawings of men in fetish gear. Behind one of the leather-clad men, you can see a little boy on an adult's shoulders waving a Pride progress flag. A parent complained, of course, and the trustees agreed that this was not age-appropriate. It looks like the school did the right thing by apologising and ordering an audit of its other books. However, the parent who complained said that they initially tried to defend the images and suggested that he was offensive for even raising the issue. The parent, who quite rightly was raising a safeguarding concern, felt that the preschool staff were implying that he was some kind of homophobe or transphobe. According to the parent, the school said, "You know it's erotic, we know it's erotic, but that's just your opinion because we're grown-ups. A child would not understand it to be erotic." I'm sorry, that is exactly the reason why this is a safeguarding concern. Children should not be desensitised to dangers like having adults behave sexually around them. It's precisely because they don't understand that they need to be protected by responsible adults. That's why children's literature used to be about fairy tales providing a warning to children, using dark stories to impart wisdom to young minds, to keep them safe and to protect their innocence. But not anymore. The author and illustrator of the book said the illustrations were a faithful representation of Pride celebrations. Well, that just sounds like another problem, doesn't it? We've all seen the footage of weird drag acts performed in front of young children, like the one at Southend recently, or the drag act in Norwich that threw tampons at kids. Whether you have kids or not, I challenge you, go down to your local bookshop and take a look at what is in the children's section. When I was in the Tate Modern earlier this year, these were the books on sale for children. Self-Care in Underwear, Courage Out Loud, 25 Poems of Power, We Need to Talk About Vaginas, Little Feminist, The Boy with Flowers in His Hair, Julian is a Mermaid, and the hips on the drag queen go swish, swish, swish. Last month, a Christian father removed his 9-year-old daughter from primary school because her teachers wanted to show her a video of a boy getting an erection and ejaculating. Research has found primary school children being taught about anal sex and given masturbation homework. If that sounds bad to you, some of the things being taught to our children are so inappropriate that I don't feel comfortable repeating them on national television. All that is considered appropriate by some teachers. Meanwhile, classical literature isn't. Whether it's of Mice and Men or To Kill a Mockingbird, Roald Dahl or Enid Blyton, classic books are being rewritten or ditched from the curriculum. Prominent children's author Jacqueline Wilson recently said that it can be justified to remove inappropriate or dated language because children don't have, quote, a sense of history. But again, that is exactly why we are supposed to teach them. Has someone spiked the drinking water? It's easy to get desensitised to all of this stuff because we're deluged with stories like this every week. But this is seriously concerning. The shifting boundaries of what is and is not acceptable is putting kids at risk. The exposure of children to adult sexuality is being normalised. And what's worse, the adults seem to be so confused that they're unable to justify why this is even wrong. This is not a disaster waiting to happen. It's already happening. This week, a leading judge said that the UK can no longer ignore calls to pay reparations for our role in the transatlantic slave trade and estimates that the UK owes £18.8 trillion. The family of former Prime Minister William Gladstone travelled to Guyana to apologise and pay reparations for their ancestors' role in the transatlantic slave trade. But now they're being called to pay reparations to Jamaica as well. But do we have a moral obligation to pay for the sins of our ancestors? Now it's time for the duel. Joining me now is broadcaster and historian Rafe Hadel-Mancu and former Labour MP Stephen Pound. Thank you so much, guys, for joining us here tonight. So, Rafe, let's start with you. You're very dead set against paying reparations.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, look, at the end of the day, none of these arguments are actually about slavery. They're about undermining the West, Britain, America, and the West. If it were really about seeking equitable distribution of reparations, we would see calls made not just to Britain and to America, but we'd also have calls made to Nigeria, to Benin, to West Africa, because we have to remember the vast majority of slaves were actually kept in bondage in Africa. There were more slaves held by other Africans in Africa than were ever transported across the Atlantic. We never hear about that. And of course, if this was really about slavery, I would have more time for the argument if those calling for reparations were equally vocal about the fact that 7 in every 1,000 Africans alive today is a slave.
Which is
10 million
more
people,
than
far
in
more.
America.
Pakistan is the global centre of slavery. Now, our Mayor of London, Sadiq Khan, wants to build a museum of slavery in London, but he went on an official visit to Pakistan. Not once did he mention the issue of slavery there. And I think that speaks volumes. This is all about an ulterior motive, which is to undermine the West.
I don't entirely agree with that. I mean, as I said, behind every great fortune is a great crime. And I think that the idea that you can somehow visit the sins of the fathers on the great-great-great-great-grandchildren is farcical. It's puerile, it's ridiculous, risible. However, there are people like Richard Drax, who has, for his family, got a huge amount of money from slave-run sugar plantations in Jamaica, who now owns, today, a vast empire in Jamaica called the Drax Estate. And I think if you are someone who is currently reaping the benefit of something which was actually built, they used to say about Bristol, every brick of this city is cemented with a black man's blood, and you can see how it becomes an emotional issue. So I think if you today, and I think Dora Trevelyan, her family were slavers, and she's actually paid reparations through the family trust. So if you're getting benefit today, I think maybe there's a moral case, not a legal one, but a moral case. If it's something that's so far back in the past, then for heaven's sake, who wasn't actually running slaves and who wasn't operating the slave trade? Pretty much, we all know the people who ran the slave trade in Africa, and believe you me, it wasn't innocent, business people in Bristol.
Oh yes, but let's be clear here, right? What we've had here is a judge saying that 18 trillion should be paid by the British taxpayers. Now, there were only 3,000 slave owners back at the time slavery was abolished, so why should the average person be asked to pay reparations for slavery when their ancestors lived lives
well, this is
of abject
I don't know.
poverty.
This is as risible as what's happening in California, where one of the governors of California said, look, we should repay every single person of black origin in California a vast amount of money because their grandparents might have worked in the southern states.
Rafe, isn't there a problem?
It's insane.
Isn't there a problem even with those who would take a limited approach of saying not the whole of the all British taxpayers should pay, but those who are the descendants of those 3,000 families should pay? Isn't there also a problem there in that people marry into families, they've got absolutely no moral responsibility for what their ancestors did? So much time has passed that to say that they are financially benefiting, that, even if you could prove that they were, as Stephen says, financially benefiting in the present, would you still say that there was no moral obligation to pay?
Oh, look, as Stephen said, if we were discussing this in 1807 or in 1833, when the British Empire became the first empire to abolish slavery and to put an end to the slave trade, I would absolutely be in favour of reparations, as I would be in favour of reparations for Jews after the Holocaust, because people were alive today. But we're talking about 6 or 7 generations. So whilst slavery was, of course, horrific, the lives of the descendants of slaves in the Caribbean and in Britain and America today are far better than if their ancestors had never left Africa, and that's a very controversial thing to say. But the GDP of all the countries in the Caribbean is 10 times higher than in West Africa, and the life expectancy is 10 to 15 years higher. In Benin, it's 60. In Trinidad, it's 74 years of age. No one has ever been able to actually demonstrate to me in what way the lives of the descendants of slaves alive today has been unfairly impinged by slavery.
I think that's profoundly controversial, Rafe.
But it's true.
Hang on a second.
So the British, just very quickly, so the British, you're saying the British abolished slavery before any other country. I'm hearing in my ear that Norway...
The British Empire. The British Empire was the first major...
Some of the Scandinavian countries did it before. But don't forget, huge amounts of reparations were paid, but they were paid to the slavers. When the Emancipation Act came through, the slavers themselves received huge reparations from the British government. But the point about West Africa...
Stephen, would you not say that was necessary to expedite?
Well, it's
the abolition of slavery. That it wouldn't have been possible. It wouldn't have been possible otherwise.
The Royal Navy
or it would
abolished.
have taken longer.
The Royal Navy abolished slavery. The Royal Navy, the West Africa Patrol, actually went down, and they were the ones who did it. And they obeyed the rule of Parliament. So I don't think that's necessarily an argument. But I think that what actually profoundly worries me about this is we'll never know in the West African. And Rafe makes a powerful, well-argued point. But how can we ever know what those countries would have been like? The Ashanti, the kingdoms of...
Oh well, we do know. If Liberia and Ethiopia were never colonized.
Liberia didn't come about till 1870. But I mean, we talk about if all the young men hadn't been plucked and taken to the plantations in Brazil or in the southern states, we can't tell. Those countries could have bloomed.
Because Europeans never actually began to have their empire in Africa until the 19th century. Slaves were being purchased from the coast, and after hundreds, if not thousands of years, there had been no great rapid advances in technology and developments there. So the idea that just in the last 200 years there would have been a surge in Africa...
I think Christianity is a crucial point.
Remember, but in terms of paying off the 3,000, in terms of paying off the slave owners, that had to be done because Parliament would never have been able to pass the legislation.
Stephen, I have two questions. I have two questions to put to you. Finally, firstly. You were about to mention the role of Christianity in the abolition of slavery.
Absolutely. What was the prime motivation behind it? What was behind Wilberforce? Come on.
Very, very briefly. One of the arguments is that, as we've just seen, Jamaica is now asking for further reparations. So you can see how the claims and the demands that people can make could escalate. Sure. What do you say to those who say, well... And yes, there is a bit tongue-in-cheek about this. Those who would say, well, we should get some compensation from Turkey or from Morocco or from anybody who was involved in the
Somalia,
slave trade.
Mauritania. Don't forget, slavery was legal in Mauritania until 15 years ago. It's a very, very recent phenomenon. Look, I always think of Desmond Tutu's famous comment as, when the white man came to our continent, we had the land and he had the Bible, and we fell to our knees and prayed. And when we stood up again, we had the Bible and he had the land. So it was a pretty brutal system, but I think Christianity was the driving force behind the emancipation of the slaves.
100% agreement.
Can we end the duel on that point? Can we agree?
Agreement.
We've ended the duel on agreement, and the agreement is that Christianity played a role in the abolition of slave trade. So what could possibly be more common sense than that? So thank you very much. To both of you. Plenty more to come this afternoon on my Common Sense Crusade. Next, we'll be discussing the persecution of Christians in Pakistan.
What you get for breakfast is something that, if we do our jobs right, you will wake up to news that you didn't know the night before.
It's a conversation. It's not just me and Eamon.
We want to get to know you, and we want you to get to know us.
From 6, it's Breakfast with Eamon and Isabel.
Monday to Thursdays on GB News,
Britain's news channel.
Westminster is going around in ever-decreasing circles, followed by the media. Britain is broken. How on earth did we get into this mess? But more importantly, how do we get out of it? Join me at 7 p.m, Mondays to Thursdays on Farage, here on GB News. We will have open, rational debate. We've got to work out how Britain moves forward from this. Join us here on GB News, the People's Channel. Britain is watching.
When the news happens, it happens here.
And really important breaking news.
Breaking news this morning.
On TV, radio and online, the news starts here on Britain's newsroom.
All the biggest stories and the answers that you need from across the UK and beyond.
Join Britain's newsroom from 9:30 on GB News.
The People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Join me, Patrick Christie's Monday to Friday, 3 till 6. We tackle the day's news agenda like you've never seen before. It's high tempo, high octane, the most controversial topics and the best guests. You will not be able to take your eyes and ears off it. I'm not afraid to ask the questions that you really want answered. 3 till 6 p.m, Monday to Friday on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
People in Britain, they love free speech, but they also love fair play.
I don't care if I'm speaking somebody from a trade union, from the Labour Party, somebody from the SNP. And I think the viewers like to see that actually we can challenge one another, but in a positive way.
We think we ask the questions that people want to ask, and often we ask the questions that we wanted to ask in Parliament but never got the chance to ask.
So join us every Saturday, 10 a.m. till noon on GB News,
Britain's news channel.
It's all about family, being in people's living rooms, all the interaction and getting to know who our viewers and listeners are.
When I was young, my dad used to say, nah, stop arguing. I wanted an outlet that would enable me to give my opinion.
People are going through a really hard time right now, and I know that you don't feel like you're being listened to by the establishment. I came to GB News because it's the People's Channel, and I want the audience to have their say on the events of the day.
We're dynamic. We do something different.
Democracy shows that the wisdom of the nation is in its people.
I get to travel to find out what the story is from a personal perspective.
The British people aren't fools. We know when we're not being told the full story.
We've got to work out how Britain moves forward from this.
It's the best country in the world.
The establishment had their chance. Now we're here to represent your views.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
We're proud to be GB News,
the People's Channel,
Britain's news channel.
Welcome back to the Common Sense Crusade with me, Emma Webb, on TV, online and on your wireless. On the 16th of August, violent Muslim mobs in Pakistan attacked Christians, their homes and churches, and two Christians were accused of blasphemy. Reports suggest that 90 homes have since been attacked and 21 churches damaged. 10,000 Christians are believed to have hidden in the fields to escape the onslaught. Here to tell us more about what is happening on the ground is Lizzie Francis, the head of Global Religious Freedom at ADF. Thank you so much for joining us today, Lizzie. So could you begin by telling us what exactly is happening on the ground and how do things stand? Because the reporting on this has actually been quite fuzzy, aside from the good work that ADF is doing.
Well, thank you for the opportunity to share about it. As you mentioned, 10 days ago in Pakistan, there was a huge amount of mob violence on the streets in Jaranwala, which is in the Punjab region of Pakistan. And this had happened after two brothers, had been accused of blasphemy. So it is reported that they desecrated the Quran publicly. They had written some insults on the pages of the Quran. And this led to a completely intense and extreme amount of mob violence as a result of it. So before the men were arrested and before they were investigated, because blasphemy is a crime in Pakistan under the Penal Code, the local Islamic clerics stirred up the crowd and said they need to act. And what we saw on the internet and through various videos of what was going on was that a few hundred people started to protest and to riot, and this turned into a crowd of about 5,000 to 7,000, it's believed, within 10 hours, and they completely ransacked the entire neighbourhood and area. You mentioned that churches were entirely ransacked, so it's estimated that 21 or 22 churches were completely destroyed. The Bibles and the hymn books within those churches were destroyed by fire. People had to flee into the sugarcane fields in their thousands as a result of this. And there was just an incredibly extreme amount of violence.
And has this been lethal? So have people died as a result of this?
It's estimated that yes, but it's very difficult to know the precise details because, as you say, the reporting is a little bit hazy. We do know that the police have now taken action and they have arrested some people as a result of it. Approximately 160 people, it's been reported. But as to the loss of life, we're still waiting.
And the UN recently, in response to a Quran burning, an Iraqi-born activist was protesting outside of, I believe it was an embassy, possibly, you can correct me if I'm wrong here. And in response, the UN they put out a resolution to ask countries to prosecute people essentially doing the same thing. Is that correct interpretation?
Yes, you're correct. So this happened in Sweden, and somebody was protesting outside the Iraqi embassy in Sweden, burning a Quran. And as a result of that, a lot of the Islamic nations around the world went to the UN and said, this is just not good enough. We need more extreme blasphemy laws. And as a result of that, the United Nations Human Rights Council actually passed a resolution in their favour, which is against freedom of speech.
And so that UN resolution, and in combination with the fact that Pakistan does have blasphemy laws, is that not really egging on and justifying, in a way, this mob violence? And wouldn't the UN take the same sort of stringent approach when it comes to the fact that these mobs have desecrated the Bible in as much as they would if it was the Quran?
Yeah, the ironic thing about the UN passing this resolution is that the UN is the watchman of international human rights. I mean, the UN Declaration on Human Rights was written in the aftermath of the Second World War to entrench the fundamental freedoms and human rights that we have as citizens. And two of those, number one, freedom of religion, and number two, freedom of expression and opinion and thought. And so by saying that blasphemy laws are okay, what the UN is doing is basically saying, actually, but not in this circumstance, not when there is offence caused to a certain religion. And of course, offence and insult are very subjective concepts. And so it was troubling that this resolution was passed.
And the situation in Pakistan really lends itself, doesn't it, to vexatious complaints. And presumably, in the case of this accusation of blasphemy, that would have also potentially been vexatious. So with the UN, putting out a resolution like this, are they not really sort of making the Christian community in Pakistan and in other countries like Pakistan that have blasphemy laws even more vulnerable to this kind of mob violence?
I completely agree. I mean, 70 countries around the world have blasphemy laws. 7 of those countries have the death penalty for blasphemy, and Pakistan is one of those countries. And only earlier this summer, after that resolution was passed, there were protesters, extremists on the streets of Pakistan demanding a more stringent blasphemy law, and that was passed through. So now the number of offences under the blasphemy law is even greater as a result of this summer. So what the UN is doing is sending a message to these 70 countries that blasphemy law is okay when it very severely impacts freedom of thought and expression, the right to be able to say something, even though people may be offended. That's what a democracy rests on and relies upon, freedom of speech.
And I've noticed this week that there has been a lot of talk, a lot of news reporting on this cable car that got stuck in Pakistan with people. People were stuck on this cable car that wasn't going anywhere. And yet at the same time, all of this mob violence is happening in Pakistan and nobody really seems to be reporting on it in the Western media. Why do you think that might be the case?
It raises a really interesting point about why certain media articles and news reports are prevalent and why others are not. I mean, religious minorities are often unreported in terms of the persecution. It's the same with the north of India. In May of this year, there is estimated that about 300 to 500 churches were completely destroyed through mob violence, and then thousands of people had to flee their homes. Christians were impacted in the Manipur region, and this is completely unreported by the Western media. So there is a complete lack, I completely agree with you on this, underreporting of religious minority persecution.
I'm going to bring in my panel here. Stephen, why do you think it is that the media isn't really paying very much attention to the persecution of Christians around the world? Is it because Christians are viewed as being the kind of hegemonic group because we in the West associate it with ourselves, and so we think they can't possibly be persecuted?
Slightly convoluted way of looking at it, and I admire the way your mind's working. But can I just say, Manipur is a very different case. I mean, Manipur is certainly not a question of just one community against the other. There's all sorts of undertones there with armed gangs coming across the border, the people coming from Burma, from Myanmar. But look, the situation in Pakistan is I think we can understand it. First of all, what the reason why Manipur sees the headlines was because 2 women were paraded naked through the streets and raped to death. It's that horrifically, dramatically terrifying. You've put your point. Do you remember George Orwell in 1984? He had a thing called the 5-minute hate. When everybody in the country would gather together for 5 minutes and hate somebody, and that's a way of actually bringing the country together. Look, nothing in Pakistan happens without ISI, Inter-Services Intelligence. They run the country. Anyone who tells you it's Sharif or Khan or anybody, they just don't know what they're talking about. It is run by that. And it is in the interest, not just of the military complex in Pakistan, but also the way it fades into the theocracy aspect of it, to actually have an identifiable enemy. And there's all the other advantages that accrue to somebody who wants to incite violence, because they'll pull the people together. There's your common enemy. We're going to hate them. We're going to burn them. They're apostates. They're horrific. I think it's utterly terrifying. But the other thing, my final point, as a Christian, I've had my faith mocked, reviled, insulted and abused virtually from the day I was born. People have been obscene poems about our Lord and Saviour. They've been horrific stuff. But I'm strong in my religion, and my faith is strong enough to take that. And I think people who actually feel that it's the end of the world because somebody scribbles, some mentally ill person throws a piece of paper from the Quran, that slightly worries me. I have confidence and strength in my faith, and I don't think that I'd be reacting in that way. And I hope most Christians would feel the same way.
Right. But let's be clear here, Christianity is the world's most persecuted religion. And the problem is most people at home aren't even aware of that, because the government, the media, even churches in the West don't give anywhere near as much attention to this. Now, we hear about Palestine all the time. There are only 5 million people in Palestine. There are hundreds of millions of Christians being persecuted. Pakistan is one of the 10 worst offenders. We quite rightly hear about the plight of women in Afghanistan and Iran. We never hear about the persecution of Christians there. We quite rightly hear about the Rohingya Muslims, about the Uyghur Muslims. We don't hear about the Chinese Christians and the Afghan Christians and the Burmese Christians who are being persecuted in those countries either. I think it's one of the biggest scandals of our time. And Archbishop Welby likes to use his pulpit and a seat in the House of Lords to talk about gender-neutral terms, about the trans debate, about environmentalism. I'd have more time for him if every single speech he should be addressing this most important issue, which is the persecution of the faithful around the world.
Ultimately, it's unfashionable. I want to give the final word to Lizzie. If people are watching this footage at home of churches being destroyed, people having their lives upended, their houses gutted, people are going to want to do something. What can people do if they see these images and they want to do something about it?
I think we need a debate about free speech in other countries. I think we need a debate about whether blasphemy laws accord with free speech and freedom of religion, because 70 countries is a large amount of countries that have these laws. And I think we need to stand up for the rights of, like you say, the most persecuted religious group, which are Christians. And it's unfashionable to speak about Christian persecution, but it's happening and it's increasing year on year. And it's increasing in a greater number of countries. So, I mean, for Christians, we need to stand up for our brothers and sisters and pray for them. But for other people, we need to stand up and say fundamental human rights demands that we take action as well.
Thank you so much, Lizzie, for joining us. Thank you very much, Rafe and Stephen, also for your comments as well. So, plenty more to come this evening on My Common Sense Crusade. Next up, we'll be talking about the lionesses being described as too white, too blonde and too blue-eyed to be representative of modern Britain. What's going on? Stay tuned.
A brighter outlook with Boxed Solar. Proud sponsors of weather on GB News.
Hello there, I'm Jonathan Vautry here with your GB News weather forecast provided by the Met Office. I hope you weren't caught out by some of the showers that we've had around today, certainly some heavy and thundery ones, and there's a chance still of seeing a few thunderstorms to start off this evening, but for many central eastern areas they will be easing their way off as we head into the night, though persisting for western England, Wales and some drizzly showers for parts of northern Scotland where it is going to remain relatively cloudy. Slightly cool night, towns and cities dropping down to 10, 12 degrees Celsius, but into single figures for some rural areas as we start off Sunday morning. Generally, the further east you are, the best of the sunshine you'll have first thing, bar the odd mist and fog patch early doors, but they'll all readily clear their way off. The showers in the west, though, will start to trundle eastwards as we head into the afternoon, generally persisting across the spine of the country into the afternoon. Again, some of those could be heavy. Some more persistent cloud and rain pushing into Northern Ireland later on, and that will hold temperatures back a touch around 15, 17 degrees Celsius. As we head into Monday, though, this area of high pressure in the Atlantic is going to gradually push its way into the UK, and that will help settle things down a touch. There is still going to be a little legacy of cloud, particularly for parts of central England into the day, so might be a bit of a grey one here, but either side of that some sunny spells developing, a few showers around at times, but generally fewer compared to Saturday and Sunday, and so generally fine for those of us lucky to have the bank holiday Monday off. Further sunny spells and scattered showers as we head throughout the rest of the week as well. Bye-bye.
A brighter outlook with Boxed Solar. Proud sponsors of weather on GB News.
The Live Desk with me, Mark Longhurst.
And me, Pip Thompson. It's here Monday to Friday on GB News.
From midday, we'll bring you the news as it breaks, whenever it's happening and wherever it's happening, from across the UK and around the world.
Refreshing, feisty, but with a bit of fun too.
If it matters to you, we'll have it covered on TV, radio and online.
Join the Live Desk on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
So Jubes & Co, we tackle the issues of the day with real robust debate, both sides of the fence, battling it out with me in the middle with my forthright opinions and views, and often really interesting things happen because you start with a position and then by the end of the debate you find actually, well, I might not have thought about that one.
What we need in this country is 2 new political parties.
You should maybe think about doing a 2024 calendar. I'm Michelle Dewberry and I'm keeping you company right through until 7 o'clock this evening.
GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's watching.
Monday to Thursday, 9 p.m. till 11 p.m. Join me, Dan Wootton. I'll bring you the sharpest takes and hottest debates. Do you not believe in prisons?
I don't believe in prisons.
I'm completely stunned. I guarantee you there'll be no spin, no bias, no censorship.
I actually was personally quite offended by it.
And no reason to go to bed.
So I guess they've always been quite woke.
That's Dan Wootton tonight on TV, radio and online. Monday to Thursday from 9 p.m. till 11 p.m. on GB News. The People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
In a world of dull and predictable radio and TV shows.
Oh, hi. On Mark Dolan tonight, we've got big guests. We drill into the big stories of the day. The show adds up to a brilliant listening and viewing experience. Mark Dolan Tonight is the most entertaining current affairs show ever, and that's a fact. That's Mark Dolan Tonight, Friday, Saturday and Sunday from 9. Only on GB News, Britain's news channel.
Like all families, we have arguments every now and then, but actually we agree on what the mission of GB News is, and that's the most fundamentally important thing.
GB News provides the kind of platform that lets all voices be heard.
We don't hold back. We're free to say what we really think. Just because some people who live in a tiny little Westminster bubble think that their particular story is important, that's not the most important story for me.
And often there will be difficult stories, stories that you won't find on the establishment media.
Because what people think in the north of England may be very different to what they're thinking in the home counties.
We're going to carry on telling the world what life is really like for households up and down the UK.
We love to be in your car, in your kitchen as you're having your breakfast, whatever you're doing, you are part of the show. If it matters to you, it matters to us.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
We're proud to be GB News,
the People's Channel,
Britain's news channel.
Welcome back to the Common Sense Crusade with me, Emma Webb, on TV, online and on your wireless. This week, one pundit said this about the Lionesses following the World Cup final. Take a look.
The only thing I would say about this picture here, what jumps out of you is that this doesn't sort of represent diverse Britain. It's all these blonde, blue-eyed girls, and, you know, I wish them well, but I do think we need to ask ourselves questions about why is it that we've got, it has a lack of diversity.
Meanwhile, in London, the Mayor of London got into a spot of bother after a document produced by the Greater London Authority described a photo of a white family as not representative of real Londoners. And on top of that, this tweet claimed that baby murderer Lucy Letby wouldn't have gotten away with her crimes for so long if it were not for the ideology of whiteness. Dr. Shola wrote, Lucy Letby exemplifies how ideology of whiteness keeps Britain in a chokehold. They believed her tears/denials, even though evidence said otherwise, for no other reason than that she's white. A black or brown nurse would have been reported to the police immediately and sacked for suspicion. What on earth is going on? To answer this, I'm joined in the studio by lawyer Anna Lutfi. So, Anna, tell us, what the hell is going on?
Well, I don't know. May I comment a little bit on the Lucy Letby case, which I think is very, very sensitive at this point in our history. It's broken. The judgment has just been handed down, and people are reeling from it. And the information that we've received is extremely sensitive, and people are grieving. Families are grieving. So, precisely for the reasons that I find Dr. Shola's comments distasteful, I will myself refrain from dealing with this case too straightforwardly in this programme, because I think it is not appropriate to take such a complex and morally difficult and challenging case, which has left so many families in dire straits, and turn it into a political football. Whether it's political football around race or the management of the NHS, you know, or cuts, I just don't think it's appropriate. So I'd rather not go there.
She mentioned in her tweet, we can park the case itself, but she mentioned something called the ideology of whiteness.
Yes.
And so many people might not know what that means because it has a real philosophical background to it. So can you explain to us what she means by the ideology of whiteness?
I think she wants to suggest, but I mean, obviously your guess is as good as mine. I'm not a mind reader, and I don't use social media, and I don't know who this person is. So I'm working off the sources you've just provided. I don't follow this person. I understand she's some sort of academic, so I presume she has sources and data to back up whatever academic points she wishes to make, derived from peer-reviewed journals, and I'd be interested to see how whiteness is defined in such journals and what the data is. But I suppose what she's trying to say is that this woman, by virtue of her lighter skin tones, has been able to avoid the law, even though she's now been handed a life sentence, in ways that a black or brown nurse would not have succeeded in doing. I just want to say one thing to your viewers, which is that whilst there are many discussions in the United States and Britain about criminality and race, and whether or not race features in criminal profiling by the police, by the Criminal Prosecution Service, it is always 100% with respect to black men or persons of colour who are male. There is no association in Western society between crime and the black female, and there is certainly no association in the minds of the public, either in cultural constructions such as films and TV series or actual real-life cases. There is no association at all between the black female and the serial killer. And in fact, I read in a recent article in The Guardian that the female serial killer profile is, according to academic research, almost always white. So where is this association between blackness and female criminality coming from? It's in the mind of Dr. Shola.
Maybe Dr. Shola can tell us. Let's move on, because we're short on time, to the Lionesses story and the Greater London Authority story, because in both these cases, people who are white, blonde-haired, blue-eyed were regarded as not representative of Britain as a whole or not representative of your average Londoner. So how do we explain what is going on here? Two comments like this in the same week. Many people will feel that this is offensive. Some people would say, hey, that's racist. And then they would have the retort, no, you're racist for saying that's racist because white people cannot suffer racism.
Well, I would like to say, first of all, that the Equality Act 2010, which represents the major piece of legislation that we have to hold various authorities to account for discriminatory attitudes or individuals to account for discriminating attitudes, makes race a protected characteristic. And the definition of race includes colour. Colour includes all colour. So persons of lighter colour and persons of darker colour, nonsensical understandings of the human race, if you ask me, but still, persons of lighter tones and persons of darker tones are all protected under the Equality Act 2010. So if you feel that certain rhetoric is creating a threatening or negative environment for you because of the colour of your skin and that you are being targeted unfairly, then you are protected under UK equality law. That's something that I think your viewers should know. There are persons of colour and there are persons of lighter colour, and they are all protected. That is one thing. The point about white people being perceived as somehow not representative of a diverse society begs many questions about the intellectual capacity of the people that we are discussing. When I looked at that picture of that family in London walking around, and I saw that the assumption was that they were white because they have lighter skin tones, my immediate response was, well, what do you know about this family? I mean, my father is blonde, blue-eyed, and he's an Arab Muslim from Lebanon. My mother is darker in her complexion, and she's English. So for me, this whole charade is precisely that. But I mean, what if it were an Eastern European family from the Balkans that we were looking at? What if it were a family with all sorts of, multiracial and interethnic and intercultural relationships that provide a very complex family structure? I would suggest that all families, if you look at them historically in terms of where they come from, how they've moved around the world and who they are religiously, culturally, ethnically, racially, they are extremely complex organisms. And to say on the basis of a picture that lighter skin tone means something, what does it mean? Those people are not welcome in London?
We've got
Is that
1 minute left. So, in a word, I want to put to both of my panellists, Rafe, is this racist?
If this was said about any other ethnic group, in all three cases, they would have lost their jobs, they'd have been cancelled from television, and likely would have been arrested by the police.
I thought the family were Polish, personally. Look, can you imagine going up to Mary Earps and saying this to Mary Earps? You know what she'd say back to you, don't you? Imagine if you say to Lauren James, who is a black woman in the team. It's absolutely embarrassing. It's like people years ago said, how come all the sprinters are black? Well, I'm sorry. It's not, people don't get positions in sport on the basis of colour. They get it on the basis of their personal skills and abilities.
And why are most MPs from Islington?
Well, I can only think of two, actually.
So thank you very much, Anna, Stephen, Rafe, thank you for all of your comments. Coming up in the final part of my Common Sense Crusade this week, we'll be joined by Tammy Peterson to discuss the death of Sheila Annette Lewis, who was denied an organ transplant because she refused the COVID vaccination. We'll also hear about Tammy's personal faith journey. Stay tuned.
Monday to Thursday nights on GB News. At 6, it's Dubes & Co. 7 o'clock, Farage. At 8, join Jacob Rees-Mogg. And at 9, Dan Wootton Tonight, followed by Headliners. On TV, radio and online. This is GB News.
Now then, Lee Anderson here. Join me on GB News on my show, The Real World, every Friday at 7 p.m.
I'm not eating bloody cat. Are you
Delicious.
mental?
Open your mouth. OK, here comes a train.
Reminds me of the scene in Singing in the Rain.
Adam, is that a good one?
Whoa! Join me at 7 on GB News, Britain's news channel.
Join me, Camilla Tominey, on Sunday mornings from 9:30, taking the politicians to task and breaking out of SW1 to see how their decisions are affecting you across the UK. Bursting the Westminster bubble every Sunday morning, only on GB News, the People's Channel. Britain's watching.
Join us every night on GB News at 11 p.m. for Headliners, which is 3 top comedians going through the next day's news stories, which is exactly what you need, because when the establishment has gone crazy, you need some craziness to make sense of it. So join us 11 p.m. every night on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I'm Andrew Doyle. Join me at 7 o'clock every Sunday night for Free Speech Nation, the show where I tackle the week's biggest stories in politics and current affairs with the help of my 2 comedian panellists and a variety of special guests.
Free Speech Nation, Sunday nights from 7 on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel. Every Sunday from 11, join Michael Portillo.
There'll be topical discussion, looking at the week before and the week to come. So kick back and relax at 11 a.m. on Sundays on GB News with me, Michael Portillo. GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I joined GB News because I was sick and tired of not hearing my views being represented, not just mine, but so many people that I knew and spoke to.
I just couldn't get my voice out there. I couldn't say anything, I couldn't do anything. Whatever the narrative was, I kind of had to follow it.
GB News is there to provide a voice for those who have been ignored by the establishment media. We think different things, we've got a different style.
GB News is here to be optimistic and positive about the future.
It's real kind of dynamic and flowing, with the audience very much at the heart of it, like a big family.
Here at GB News, we talk about the things that matter to you.
Hearing the voices from right across our towns and cities, especially our towns.
All sides of the argument represented with a heavy dose of opinion.
We're on a mission here to make a difference.
And the GB News family really is here for you, and whatever time of day you can watch or listen.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
We're proud to be GB News,
the People's Channel,
Britain's news channel.
Welcome back to the Common Sense Crusade with me, Emma Webb, on TV, online and on your wireless. A woman from Alberta, Canada, has died after she was refused an organ transplant because she refused the COVID vaccination. Sheila Annette Lewis was diagnosed with a terminal disease in 2018 and was told that she would not survive without a transplant. Now, hopefully we'll be joined in a minute by Tammy Peterson, but first I'm joined here in the studio by Darren Grimes, GB News' very own. So what did you think when you saw this case? Because we had a case here in the UK where someone was refused medical treatment because of their views on gender and trans issues. What do you think about people being denied medical treatment because of choices that they make based on their own conscience?
I think we're moving in that direction in ever-increasing ways, Emma. I think it's really quite concerning for freedom and liberty in a country such as ours that's supposed to be a champion and bedrock of those values, because everything from debanking, which seemed minuscule at the time, but this is what I've always worried that it would turn into, which is being denied essential services like an organ transplant. It's an abhorrent case, and I hope we can actually get her up, because I really want to hear about it. But I can't understand the direction that we're going in, Emma, and I think it's really frightening.
We've got Tammy Peterson now with us down the line. Hi, Tammy. Thank you so much for joining us. So I want to begin by asking you about this case specifically, because you and your family have been very outspoken against the tyrannical approach of Justin Trudeau's Canadian government during the pandemic. And this seems to be a real obvious cost of those rules and regulations. So what is the situation like now in Alberta, in Canada? Are people still suffering the effects of what I would call authoritarianism?
Well, absolutely, and not just in Alberta, but in British Columbia, that is just west of Alberta. The doctors and the nurses weren't allowed to go back to work if they weren't vaccinated, so they have a shortage of doctors in British Columbia. They pretty much said, you're not welcome to come back to work because you didn't go along with your vaccine. Simple as that.
And I know that you have a fantastic podcast and you interview Christians from all around the world. Do you get a sense from having conversations with people of what the state of play is around the world in terms of persecution against people for standing by their own consciences? Has this affected your understanding of, say, the reality of good and evil in the world? Do people feel that this is a sort of international phenomenon of not being allowed to stand by their own consciences?
We did travel very broadly. We went, I think, to 50 different countries, and we went to some of the more Eastern Bloc countries that were underneath totalitarianism, some of them right up till 1992 in Albania. And those people are shaking their heads and they said, "What are you people playing with? Don't you know that we have been under the thumb of communism for decades here, and we're just climbing out, and we have no desire to go back in that direction again? How can you be so blind to go in this direction and lose all your liberties?"
Tammy, we've only got a little while left, and I want to ask you about your personal faith journey, because I know that you've been on a really interesting journey, and I'm interested to know how that has interwoven itself into the events of the last 3 years.
I came down with what they thought was a fairly treatable kidney cancer, renal cell carcinoma, and they did surgery on me and then biopsied it and found out that it was much more lethal and told me I had 10 months to live. And I was in the doctor's office with my husband. We were both shocked, but in my usual manner, I have had a tendency through my life to have some self-doubt and some cynicism, I think. And so I was willing to accept that diagnosis. But when I went home to tell my son, and I saw the hurt in his eyes and the grief on his face, I realized that his love for me was way more than my love for myself. And it struck me very deeply, and I could feel the weight of the world lift off my shoulders. And I realized at that point that a doctor has his opinion, but it's an opinion, and the only way I'll know if I'm going to live or die is by asking God. And so that made it easier for me to live through all of this. I spent my time praying and surrounding myself with the medical help in a state of gratitude, and to have my family around me also in a state of gratitude. And that made it much more tolerable. And the way that it came out, I am very grateful for, but it's not up to me. I realize it's only up to our Lord.
Thank you so much, Tammy, for sharing your story with us. And I know that every week on this show, we like to end with a closing prayer, and Tammy has very kindly agreed to read that for us this week. So over to you, Tammy.
Oh, I see. I didn't know I was reading. I have to find it. Just a minute. It's just right here. Let's see.
I can. Have you got it there, Tammy, or shall I dive in?
I've got it. No, I've got it. So this is from the Common Book of Prayer, and it's the prayer for today. Almighty and everlasting God, who art always more ready to hear than we are to pray, and art wont to give more than either we desire or deserve, pour down upon us the abundance of thy mercy, forgiving us for those things whereof our conscience is afraid, and giving us those good things which we are not worthy to ask, but through the merits and mediation of Jesus Christ, thy Son, our Lord. Amen.
Thank you so much, Tammy, for your time this evening. You've been watching the Common Sense Crusade with me, Emma Webb. Calvin is back next week, which means I get to go on my holiday. Thank you to everyone who's tuned in for the past month. Calvin will be back in his rightful place next Saturday at 7 p.m. Next up, it's the Saturday 5, but before that, it's the weather. Deus Volt.
That warm feeling inside, from boxed boilers, proud sponsors of weather on GB News.
Hello there, I'm Jonathan Vautry here with your GB News weather forecast provided by the Met Office. I hope you weren't caught out by some of the showers that we've had around today, certainly some heavy and thundery ones, and there's a chance still of seeing a few thunderstorms to start off this evening, but for many central eastern areas they will be easing their way off as we head into the night, though persisting for western England, Wales and some drizzly showers for parts of northern Scotland where it is going to remain relatively cloudy. Slightly cool night, towns and cities dropping down to 10, 12 degrees Celsius, but into single figures for some rural areas as we start off Sunday morning. Generally, the further east you are, the best of the sunshine you'll have first thing, bar the odd mist and fog patch early doors, but they'll all readily clear their way off. The showers in the west, though, will start to trundle eastwards as we head into the afternoon, generally persisting across the spine of the country into the afternoon. Again, some of those could be heavy. Some more persistent cloud and rain pushing into Northern Ireland later on, and that will hold temperatures back a touch around 15, 17 degrees Celsius. As we head into Monday, though, this area of high pressure in the Atlantic is going to gradually push its way into the UK, and that will help settle things down a touch. There is still going to be a little legacy of cloud, particularly for parts of central England into the day, so might be a bit of a grey one here, but either side of that some sunny spells developing, a few showers around at times, but generally fewer compared to Saturday and Sunday, and so generally fine for those of us lucky to have the bank holiday Monday off. Further sunny spells and scattered showers as we head throughout the rest of the week as well. Bye-bye.
That warm feeling inside. From Boxed Boilers, proud sponsors of weather on GB News.
What you get for breakfast is something that, if we do our jobs right, you will wake up to.